Well, good morning. I want to thank everybody for being here this morning as we start to wind down our study into the divided kingdom here. I believe counting this morning, we have 3 more classes this morning, and then Wednesday night and next Sunday night, or next Sunday morning, I believe is, looking at the schedule here, is when we will wrap up our trimester. So thank you for being with us through the trimester so far. And please just hang on with us a little bit longer as we wrap up our study. So as you can see here up on the board, moving into class number 31 for the trimester, we're going to be looking primarily at these 4 individuals here and the events that happen around their reigns and around their time. But before we get started into our study, as usual, let's bow to a word of prayer. Lord, we want to thank you so much for all that we have learned so far studying about your people and their history as a kingdom on this earth and all of the things that we can learn and apply to our lives from them. We pray that you will help us to pull a little bit more this morning and that we might come out better servants of you because of it. In your son's name, amen. All right, so looking here, you can either turn 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles, chapters 23 or 35 respectively. We get a lot of the same information again as usual. We will kind of flip back and forth as we get varying levels of detail, but that's nothing new. We've been doing that all trimester. Looking here at our list of kings of Judah, of course we are well past the end of the kingdom of Israel now, so we're entirely focused on Judah here. We'll get the last bit of green there, the end of Josiah's reign as the last good king of Judah, and then we'll look at the next 3 following behind him. They're all of them read as bad, wicked, evil kings, depending on which adjective is used to describe them in your particular translation. So looking here at the end of the life, the end of the reign of Josiah, which Ben did such a wonderful job covering on Wednesday, the reforms and how it was the first Passover that was really good, and that there was not one like it in the kingdoms of Judah or Israel before or after. So this is going to be the study of what happens next for him. So we see here he reigned about 13 years after this fixing the Passover. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt is kind of headed through as this next event that we see. So we have the good Passover, about a 13-year blip where things are going really good for Judah. And then we get this events here with Pharaoh Necho. He's headed through Judah's territory on his way to assist the Assyrians in a fight against the Babylonians, who have put together a little alliance coalition of some of the surrounding smaller countries that the Assyrians have dominated and have been ruling over. The Babylonians are at this time rebelling, trying to throw off the Assyrian rule in the area. And as we see, they begin their rise to be the next kind of power over that Middle Eastern area. But so looking there in 2 Kings, verse 29 of chapter 23, in the days of Pharaoh Necho, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. So he's headed up there to the Assyrians, not to fight them, to join them and be an ally on that side of the fight against Babylon. And in the king's passage here, we get a very brief snippet of his pass through Judah. In the king's passage, he comes through, Josiah decides he's going to come out and fight the Egyptians. And it says, as soon as Pharaoh saw him, he killed him. And that's all we get kind of that event in the king's passage. Just he saw him, he died right away. If we flip over to the Chronicles passage, we get a good bit better of an insight into how this kind of actually laid out here. looking at verse 21 over in the Chronicles passage. And so we are looking at a point here as Pharaoh starts to come through. It'd be 2 Chronicles chapter 35, starting in verse 21 here we'll read. But he sent envoys to him, saying, "What have we to do with each other, King of Judah? I am not coming against you this day, but against the house of which I am at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you." So we do get a little bit more here, less cut and dry. He saw him and killed him on his way, which in the King's passage seems more like just an opportunity. I'm going to stop through and wipe these guys out on my way to fight. He was trying to just pass through and actually gave Josiah a warning saying, God sent me to go here and do this. I don't have anything to do with you. Stay out of my way. But of course here, something must have happened because we get the story that Josiah dies in this incident. And so if we keep reading, nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So again, he sent the warnings, don't come out to fight me. You don't want any part of this. We don't want any part of you. Josiah decides he wants to fight anyway. And very early in the battle, he gets fatally wounded. Not the only king we're ever told about that disguises himself as a common soldier and catches an arrow. You'd think they might learn from that by now. But so he gets wounded, taken away from the battle. And then we kind of get a little bit more of a slightly conflicting, either he died there at Megiddo and they carried away his body in a chariot. We get, as is told in the King's passage or in the Chronicles passage, they carried him away in his second chariot back to be buried in Jerusalem, where he dies. So probably I think it's more likely that he is wounded and then in transit down to Jerusalem he passes away as he's riding in the chariot down there and then is buried. And as I said, Josiah here, that ends the reign of the last good king of Judah. So from here on out, it's downhill for the country of Judah. Now, before we move on a little bit here, can anybody tell me why it might be significant that Egypt was going to fight Babylon and has a hiccup here with Judah? Why might it be, other than we get that God told Pharaoh to go do it, why might Josiah have not wanted to interrupt that? What do we know, having the whole story, that he wouldn't have known quite yet, that he might have said, maybe I will let you just go fight Babylon for me? Who is it that ends up taking Judah in various waves and taking them into captivity and wiping them out as a country? The Babylonians. So you'd think maybe, looking back now, if somebody could have just whispered in Josiah's ear, hey, maybe just go let Egypt fight that battle for you. Maybe they might have lasted a little bit longer there. But that didn't happen, and Josiah then dies there in that battle with the Egyptians. And so his son is put in place by the people of Judah. Jehoahaz is put in to the throne at 23 years of age. He only is king for about 3 months, and he's a very evil king. And that is the vast majority of what we know about Jehoahaz. We don't know a whole lot about anything he did in that 3 months. Probably didn't do a whole lot. But at 23 years old, that's younger than I am even, taking over a country and lasts all of 3 months before he's dethroned here. And so then we get a little bit more of the story into what happens to him. He's not killed to be replaced on the throne. He is actually deposed by Pharaoh Necho. So Pharaoh goes up to fight a battle, loses that battle, and then on his way back down to Egypt, he stops in, takes Jehoahaz off the throne, and takes him, very likely as a slave, all the way back to Egypt, where he later dies. But so he replaces him. Necho actually puts his older brother on the throne in his place. So kind of an interesting tidbit there. The people of Judah didn't take the oldest son of Josiah to put him on the throne, which is how a line of succession typically works with a king, with a monarchy, is the oldest firstborn child, son usually, is put on the throne. It looks like they took the second child and put him on the throne instead. And then when Pharaoh comes through, kind of corrects that for him. And that brings us to Jehoiakim, who, as we said, was the older brother. He was 25 when he was put on the throne, which if you take 23 plus 3 months does not make 25, is how we know he's older than his brother Jehoahaz was. He reigned for about 11 years, so a good bit more successful, but he was also evil there. And we get a little bit of insight here. So he was a vassal king then to the Pharaoh of Egypt. So Pharaoh puts him on the throne, actually changes his name from Eliakim to Jehoiakim, and puts him on the throne instead of his brother. Some of the political reasoning behind why he would have done that, we see a lot of, or it's very likely that Jehoahaz would have been a supporter of more of the Babylonian uprising against Assyria, is what the working theory is that he supported Babylon, was leaning that way, would have been paying tribute more than likely to Babylon than Egypt. And so when Necho comes through, he takes away somebody that's supporting his main enemy at this point, puts in somebody on the throne that's going to support him instead, and make Jehoiakim, or Eliakim was his original name there, a vassal king. And so, as we said here, he was put in place for being a supporter of Egypt over Babylon, and he paid tribute every year to the Egyptians. Paid 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold each year, which is a lot of money, but is not a lot of money compared to some of the amounts that have been thrown around throughout our class period here. We talked about how Solomon had decorative shields that were built and hung on a wall that were 70 talents of gold in weight apiece. So a relatively small amount compared to the amounts of money that we've been seeing thrown around and used to pay for this and that throughout the class, which can speak to how over the last bit Judah has vastly declined, and how a lot of that wealth is not in the area after having to pay the Assyrians for so long, and then the Babylonians for a little bit, and then now to the Egyptians. So Jehoiakim is then also taken captive by the Babylonians. After about his 11 years, the Babylonians have worked their way around. They get to Judah, and he's taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, along with, in this first wave, several of his officials. Daniel, Mananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are three very predominant figures that you would probably recognize that were taken in this first wave here. Can anybody else tell me why those three names may not be as recognizable, or what we should or more commonly do know these three men as? Yep, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are among this first wave of people that would have been taken from Judah to Babylon with Daniel here, and with Jehoiakim. And so then obviously we have that story where Nebuchadnezzar brings them and tries to set them up as somewhat minor officials in his own kingdom, gives them the choice foods of all the meats and the vegetables and all of this, tries to give them the best of everything they can, probably is kind of a bit of a bribe to buy into the Babylonian bandwagon here. But we, of course, know that Daniel and his friends there turn it all down, remain faithful to the Lord while they're captives there in Babylon. And then they prosper despite turning down all of the best and brightest of what the Babylonians try to offer. Included in that, we have the story for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego of the fiery furnace, which we won't go into a whole lot today, just to recap on it, where they refuse to bow to the image that's carved of Nebuchadnezzar, and repeatedly they get this kind of back and forth, bow to me, bow to me, bow to me, no we won't, no we won't, no we won't. And so he finally says, throw them in the furnace, that we know was so hot that even the guards that threw them in were burned as they tried to throw them into the furnace. And we see the image of the fourth man that's standing in there with them, and they're saved from those flames, that not a single hair was touched on their head. So we get all of that story is running parallel to the events in Judah in this timeline. Would have been very much after the reign of Jehoiakim, if they're all taken to Babylon there. And so that leads to our fourth king for the day. We've got about 37-ish verses between the Kings and the Chronicles passages, so about maybe 15 or 16, depending on which translation, to tell the same stories of the same three kings. Some of them have got 2 verses, and he reigned for 3 months and was taken captive, and he reigned for 11 years and was taken captive. But Jehoiakim here would be the son of Jehoiakim, is who the people of Judah put on the throne. A leader's taken or killed, and they pick someone new to put on the throne. Is only 18 years old when he is put on the throne. Again, he only reigned for 3 months, and he was an evil king. And I know we're blowing through this rather quick here, but hopefully we'll have time to spend looking at the campaign map that I've got coming up here. But so we're going to look at, we've got a good bit here that we can talk about with Jehoiachin going forward. So Jehoiachin kind of becomes the king over the first big sections of the fall of the kingdom of Judah. We had a little bit of captivity going on when Jehoiakim is taken, and a handful of his officials are taken. But under Jehoiachin is when things really start to go bad, when they really start taking people in large numbers. So Nebuchadnezzar comes and besieges Jerusalem here. And we get that it's roughly in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule that he finally makes it all the way around to Judah, gets Jehoiakim, takes them back, and then they make their way back over and to really besiege Jerusalem here and try to be the end of it. So he goes in there, and this word besieged or besieges really kind of leaves the thought of a defending city that's holed up, trying to fight off an army that's encircled the city, camping them off, having them isolated from everybody else. That's not really what happens here. It seems like the city gets surrendered, and at the first sign of trouble, Jehoiachin gives up. He waves the white flag rather quickly, surrenders himself, his mother, his servants, his officials, and the officials of his household. So essentially, Nebuchadnezzar gets there, and Jehoiachin, an 18-year-old kid that's only been king for 3 months, panics and says, "Don't kill us, we give up." Walks out the gate with his hands up, we give up, lets them right into the city to start taking everybody. And so they get into the city here, and the temple is sacked. And we'll look at here, let me see if this is the Kings or Chronicles passage. I believe it's in the Kings passage that we get the good description of what happens next here that we'll read from. All right, so I'm supposed to stop at verse 10 there, so I don't get to read it out of the King's passage. But so Jerusalem gets sacked. I get to go through verse 17. Yay. Gives us a little bit of extra here that we can read. So we'll look at 2 Kings 24. We'll pick up in verse 10 here and read through verse about 17. And so at the time of the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiakim, king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon, himself and his mother and his servants and his officials and his palace officials. The king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. So that's not the 8th year of Jehoiakim's reign, the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, as we know that Jehoiakim only reigned for about 3 months. And so then back in verse 13, and he carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. And he cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon king of Israel had made, as the Lord had foretold. He carried away all of Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained except for the poorest people of the land. So he gets into the city gates after Jehoiakim surrenders and immediately takes anything and everything and everyone that he perceives to be of any kind of value. Goes into the temple, takes anything that's made of gold. What limited stuff is left from the days of Solomon after the number of times that the temple has been sacked, he takes. What little bit has been repaired since that time, from the time of Hezekiah and Josiah, the little bit of work that they did to repair the temple and get things back on the right track, he takes all of those valuables out, and then he takes all of the best people as well. All of their standing military, their mighty men of valor would have been essentially their army, takes all of their fighters captive, and then takes all of their craftsmen and smiths. And so he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, the king's mother, the king's wives, and his officials, the chief men of the land he took into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor and 7,000 craftsmen and metal workers, 7,000 craftsmen and the metal workers 1,000, all of them strong and fit for war. So again, he takes all of these men captive. The army he's going to turn around and repurpose to go fight for him as he continues his campaign of the area. And then the craftsmen and the metal workers to support, the metal workers probably support that army more than likely, making weapons and armor. And the craftsmen to help build up the city of Babylon itself and make it what is believed to have been one of the cultural marvels of the area, but throughout most of the world even. And then he leaves just the absolute poor, what many of the time would have been considered the worthless, not worth the effort to take them away as slaves even. He just leaves there in Babylon. And so here, I've got a little bit of time here. I put together / stole from some of Dad's old material, a bit of a campaign map, and so you can kind of see, the movements of the various forces in the area here. You've got Egypt down there in the bottom left corner of bottom left for me and you guys. Sorry, I'm looking at the wall over here, and I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right instructions over here. So Egypt there in the bottom left, Babylon on the right-hand side there, and then Chemesh up there in the north is where Egypt is kind of headed to go help the Assyrians in their fight against Babylon. Nineveh was the main capital of the Assyrians, and then Haran kind of becomes a secondary capital for the Assyrian people there. But so at the start of our You cannot see that color at all. At the start of our study here, the Egyptians, which you can't see here, make a bit of their way up and stop there at Megiddo, where they have that little skirmish with Josiah. And then they kill Josiah there. And then they proceed up to Chermesh to reinforce the Assyrians. Thank you very much. Following the cursor there. And then while they're doing that, we have the Babylonians come up here to about where Nineveh is. They take Nineveh, which is a big move. That's the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time, which is supposed to be the area superpower that has kind of got everybody on lockdown. And then they follow the retreating Assyrians over here to Haran, where they have another battle there, and proceed over here to the Chermesh. The Egyptians then retreat, come back down towards Megiddo, where they stop, take Jehoiakim as captive and they take all these Jehoias. They take one Jehoiah captive and they put a different Jehoiah on the throne. Jehoahaz is taken captive and Jehoiakim is put on the throne here as they make their way back down through Megiddo and then back to Egypt with him. The Babylonians make their way down to Jerusalem and they take Jehoiakim off the throne and take him back to Babylon along with Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as well as a number of others there in the first kind of wave of captivity here. The people that are remaining in Judah put Jehoiachin on the throne then in that place. And then, let me go back here, backwards. So then the Babylonians there have got that trade or that path back and forth between Babylon and Judah here, where they start to come through and they make trips and take Judah away in waves. And so that really becomes the end of Judah as any kind of stable country in the area. They end up with one more king that Darrell's going to talk about, that the Babylonians put on the throne, and is kind of the king of the remainder of the fall. So where Jehoiachin kind of gives up to Babylon and begins these first two waves of captivity. The Babylonians will put, one translation will call it his uncle, another calls it his brother. So depending on what that relationship is there, another one of his immediate family members gets put on the throne for the remainder of the country of Judah. And so before I spend a few minutes here just kind of saying thank you for participating, has anybody else got any comments, questions about any of this stuff that has gone through or just throughout the trimester, anything that you'd like to point out and discuss for a moment or two here? I probably should be a little bit less surprised that he's the one to know that this is one of the major battles of the ancient world and that it smelled like blood for a year there at that site. But it's a very good point to be made there that throughout our whole study here, Egypt has been a pretty consistent power in the area. that we've seen multiple people have gone and been subservient to Egypt or have fled to Egypt for aid, or have tried to make strong political ties to Egypt and had strong trade through there in that southern part of the Middle East. That regardless of what's been going on with Israel and Judah, Egypt has kind of been a mainstay there. And so then they fought with they had problems with the Syrians, and Egypt was consistent. They had problems with the Assyrians, and Egypt was consistent. And so then here we have the first time where Egypt isn't able to maintain their status as a world power when Babylon comes through. Which speaks a lot there to also Babylon, who have to overthrow the Assyrians in the first place, who had a pretty strong grip on the area up until this point. And then they come through and end up taking over almost the entirety of what you can see on this map here, including a good portion of Egypt ends up falling to Babylon. Yes.
And also the battle that is in Megiddo is one of many battles that happen in that area that's going to add to the figurative and symbolic meaning of the use of the word Megiddo or Armageddon that we're going to find in Revelation. So you've got a connection over thousands of years that is part of our Christian beliefs as well because of the symbolism of that little place there.
Yeah, for a relatively little city there in the area that the Megiddo is named after, that's a good point, that there are several battles or major changes in rulership, we'll call it, where people are killed in the area of Megiddo or have a fight in that area. Off the top of my head, you can think when Jehu was hunting down the house of Ahab, he chased him as far as Megiddo and took him out there. And then here also Josiah and a number of others. But these were all big battles in the area.
But knowing that information helps to inform you in your understanding of the book of Revelation, because it's going to be, because of all that, Armageddon or Megiddo is going to be used as a symbolic thing to teach a lesson in the book of Revelation.
Right. And just to make sure everybody could hear, he makes the point that this Megiddo becomes kind of the base word for Armageddon or Armageddon in helping to show that in Revelation, when it starts talking about Armageddon, why that would have been so significant, both to us knowing the whole story, but also especially to the Jewish people of the time that have got such a history with this place, of it being a place of death and battle and war. Thank you. That's a really good point. Yes. So Darrell is pointing out here that the 30th chapter of Ezekiel is dedicated to telling the story of Egypt's defeat by Babylon and how it's described as a judgment of the Lord, which is not at all surprising. Most of the stories we have of Egypt is not necessarily where they were very nice to God's people in most situations, leading up to, and that's not even accounting for all of the things that Egypt ends up doing with God's people thereafter. But yeah, thank you, Darrell. That's a good point. So if you would like to go and read that in Ezekiel, the 30th chapter about Babylon.
Just a point of interest, the king Eliakim that Pharaoh puts on the throne, a quick search, the word Eliakim means God will set up or God will establish.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he changed his name, kind of a subtle hint that this is someone else's plans at play. The word Jehoiakim, from what I understand, means God's avenger. So, the Egyptians have just seen a terrible defeat. They're kind of coming back with their tail between their legs. And Nico seems to be aware of Yahweh to some degree. So I find it interesting that he's still kind of acknowledging the God of Israel, but at the same time subtly taking control of his people, or attempting to.
Right. Makes a good point there. Eliakim translates as set up by God, or to be set up by God. And then Pharaoh changing that to Jehoiakim kind of changes it to God's avenger, or the one that has been set up by God or for God. Again, proving that Pharaoh Necho, at least to some degree, was aware of Yahweh or Jehovah as the Jewish God, but also as a legitimate, and acknowledging him more so than most of the surrounding countries do. Which again points back to where he tried to tell Josiah, God sent me to do this, and so he knows what's going on here. Yes, Floyd.
Yeah, he made that claim that God sent him to do it. It may have been a correct claim, but God was sending him to lose in the battle, to change the power of the east. And Ezekiel chapter 29 actually had stated that Egypt is going to give Canaan to King Nebuchadnezzar because he didn't get the spoils of Tyre, which was God's word on Tyre. And actually, the island city actually saw the causeway being built, he evacuated all the valuables, and Nebuchadnezzar's army didn't get the plunder. And so Ezekiel says, hey, Egypt is going to be your reward. So this was definitely of God. And Necho says, yeah, God sent me. God may indeed have sent him, but not to win the battle.
Right. That is a very good point there that I hadn't considered yet. God very well may have sent Necho to fight the Babylonians. That doesn't necessarily mean he sent him to win against the Babylonians. Again, referring over to Ezekiel in 29 and 30 there, that Egypt is going to be a reward for Babylon, and a punishment for Egypt is that they're going to be captured by Babylon, is for a lot of the things that Egypt has done here in the area. But so him telling Josiah, hey, God sent me to go do this, get out of the way, very well probably was a very valid claim that God said, hey, go fight the Babylonians here. But again, a good point that more than likely also was pointing to God was sending them with the intention of them going and losing that battle.
It's also interesting, Ezekiel wrote all these prophecies from Babylon.
Yeah.
First carried away there.
Yeah.
A little tidbit about Jehoiakim. He's not mentioned in Matthew 1 and Jesus' genealogy. You talked about Jehoiakim being sort of maybe a usurper, in that he was not the firstborn. And so maybe it seems like God thought that too.
Yeah.
He didn't mention it.
Pointing out here that Jehoahaz is not included in Christ's genealogy, and referring back to how Jehoahaz was not the oldest born son of Josiah. And so him taking the throne, it does say that the people of Judah put him on the throne, but he definitely, it appears to me, made out was not the one that was intended to be there for any amount of time. And God definitely makes sure that happens, only giving him 3 months. It's a good point. And he also pointed out that Ezekiel was writing a lot of that from captivity in Babylon at the time. So he being amongst the first to be taken there with Jehoiakim in all of them. And so I do want to take just a few minutes here, unless anybody else, I don't want to cut anybody off. If anybody else had something. Okay. We've only got about 3 or 4 minutes here. I do want to say thank you to everybody. I'll echo what Ben said on Wednesday. It's very obvious when you guys are prepared for class. It makes it a lot easier for me to prepare to class when I know that you guys know what I'm talking about. So I appreciate that. As Dad said in the very first class, this is my first time especially in the auditorium, but teaching at an adult class. I've worked with some of the younger people several times, but I really appreciate you guys helping to learn with me and teach me throughout this trimester. It's definitely been beneficial to me, and though I've grown up knowing a lot of these stories, I've learned a lot more different aspects of them trying to prepare to teach them and studying with all of you than I had ever really read into them before. So again, I'll say thank you for participating, thank you for being prepared, and just thank you for joining with us. It's a lot better to study with a group than it is to study alone. And so we've got just about 2 minutes here that I'll let everybody out early. And again, thank you for studying with me.